So we've talked a lot about the code needed to make a website, but we haven't gone into as much detail about actually designing a web page. Of course, you'll want to keep the CRAP principles in mind with each decision that you make, but we're going to talk about some specific approaches that designers take to create effective websites. One thing to remember is that you can always look at other websites for inspiration, so don't be afraid to check out how other people are doing it, maybe make a note of what you think works and what doesn't. But in the end, you're the designer and you are going to be making all the decisions. So along the way, don't be afraid to try things. It won't always work, but at least you get some experience figuring out how to implement certain solutions. So I want to talk a little bit about uh, web design versus print design. So if you remember back to our history of the web discussion, you might remember that the early websites were just collections of scientific articles. Basically, they had taken what was normally printed on paper and just copied it to a website. So obviously, this is no longer what the web is limited to. It's not the same as print. You can come up with a beautiful newspaper layout that's pixel perfect, and then once you print it, that's it. So compare this to websites where the content is constantly changing, sometimes triggered by user events. So you can click a button and something might pop up or something might change. You can embed videos on a web page. You can't have videos in a newspaper except in Harry Potter. Anyway, it's a problematic ideal to think of the websites that you make as final and finished projects or products. So although we think of web pages as pages, quote pages, they're not the same as a page that you might find in a book. So it might be more helpful to think of web pages an arranged view or arranged content um, that is arranged how you're seeing it at that time, but it won't necessarily look that way if you were to visit it on your phone, or even a week from today, it might be completely different. So this is something to keep in mind when designing. You can always go back and add to it and take stuff away. So despite all of that, there are a few concepts that we can use from print design to help us make more effective websites. So we have this idea of visual hierarchy. And this is just the idea where you emphasize the stuff on your site that you want everyone to kind of look at first. This is the most important stuff on your website. The content should be arranged logically, so you have similar content being grouped together. This kind of sounds like our proximity discussion from before. Visual balance is just having an overall balance between text and visuals. So there should be a balance between all the components on your website in order to come up with this cohesive design. So you want to be consistent with your color and your typography choices. Basically, if you follow the CRAP principles, you'll be more likely to achieve an effective balance and hierarchy. There are a number of ways that we do this as designers, a number of conventions for where things normally go. The header usually contains the site identity, so whose site is this? You might find a logo or a company name, stuff like that. The footer normally contains information about the site or the organization. You might find some contact information here or the address of the company for whose website it is, copyright information, careers page, that kind of stuff. I mean, if you just go look at the footer on most websites, you'll see what kind of goes in here. There are the normal interface elements that I'm sure you've seen or used, some of which we've learned how to make in this class, like links, buttons, modals. A modal is kind of a little screen that pops up, maybe if you click a button or something like that. We have lists and tables. We went over a number of these in class. But when people who are using your website see these familiar elements, they normally know how to use them because there's kind of a convention that we've built up for them. Finally, just watch page length and text width. So if you're on a web page that is super long and there's just a ton of content, it's going to be a lot harder for the user to find that stuff. So, I mean, this site is really long, but I mean, it's kind of arranged in a way where you read it from top to bottom. They're not all going to be like this. If you do something like that, make sure you have stuff in place like maybe that top button that we learned how to make that can take you back up to the top, or a header that scrolls with the page that has the different sections on it so you can find it easily. that sort of thing. So when you're actually making a page layout in HTML, remember those structural elements that we learned. Like we had the header and the nav and the footer, the aside, all of those. And then anything that doesn't match one of those structural elements, you can just put it in a div. So this kind of looks, this section here, this is a related set of content. So maybe this could be a good candidate for a div. And then they have this margin in between them that show that these bullet points are associated with this, and these bullet points are associated with this. One thing to remember is if you change the page, if you change the window of the browser, this can break content depending on how you have your container set up. So I guess I can't show you on here. Oops. Yeah, so if I were to be viewing this on mobile, I've done some work to make sure that it looks okay. But if you have this div, say this whole div here was set to 500 pixels, but you view it on a mobile device that's only 300 pixels wide, 200 of those pixels are going to be cut off. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're setting the widths there. And one way to know if this is working or not is just to test it. Test your design on multiple browsers, devices. It should be able to work on all of them. And this is related to responsive web design, which is this concept of making your web designs work on all these different things. And we're going to go into that in detail in a few weeks. So some page layout issues. I talked about this one. You don't want really, really long, huge blocks of text. So this is getting to be a little bit long here, but just having these shorter improves legibility. We have the margins, which we've talked about a lot. This idea of creating white space to show related content and organize your content. So here's an example of a margin. Gutters are kind of like these margins here, but they're used to separate columns. I can see if I can do an example here real quick. So if I have a div, maybe I have, actually here I'll do content one. I'll do another one down here. All right, so by default, they're going to show up as block elements. So now I'm going to target divs that live inside of other divs. So now you can see where both of those are. And do this one as 5. You know what, I'm just going to make this easier and make this a paragraph. Okay, and then do this one, let's give it a width. Do 600 pixels. And then we'll do width 300 pixels, display inline block. We've got 200 pixels. So by default, the browser adds a little bit of something in here, but I can add another one. Oh my goodness. Fix that again. And then I'll add my dig div here and just make these 100. Okay. So if I want to do in here maybe margin right 24 pixels, I added a lot more space in here. So this is what we think of as a gutter. So it's a white space between all of this content. I'm trying to think maybe. Kind of makes more sense when there's more content to show there. But yeah, if you have these big long columns of stuff, you just have that gutter content in there. As far as typography goes, you never really know how your text is going to look on a user screen. They have the final control over it. So this is what I look at it looks like when I look at it, but that's not necessarily what everyone will see. So for example, if you had a visual disability of some sort where you had trouble reading small text, you might do something like hit the Control plus button. You can see I'm zooming in a lot. So I might be reading it like this. So even if I say I want my text size to be something specific, someone might get on there and immediately change that to be something bigger. So we kind of got to do our best effort on that and just try to make it look good in all the different sizes. And a lot of that comes from just testing it and seeing how it looks. So in addition to that, when you set the fonts that you want, the user's not necessarily going to have all the fonts. So for example, if you install some really, really cool decorative font on your computer and you make a website and you say, okay, I want this font to be Comic Sans Fire Text or something really cool. That's not that cool, I know. Unless you give them that font along with your website, it's not going to display on theirs. So we have what's considered CSS web safe fonts. I have a link to it here where you can actually set your font family in CSS to some of these common combinations. So if you look here, you have this paragraph, font family, and then you have a bunch of the fonts that you would want them to use. So when you're setting font family, it kind of uses this fallback system where it tries to render this first one that you have here. So in this example, Times New Roman, that's a pretty common font that I think most computers would have, but for some reason it wasn't on the computer. The browser would try to render it using the next one in line, in this case Times. And if it can't find that, then it falls back to a generic serif font, and the browser will just choose whichever serif font your computer has on it and show your web page in that. You can do the same thing with sans serif fonts. So here are a couple really common font families that you could use. Georgia Serif, Palatino. They would look something like this. You can also do the sans serif, Arial, Helvetica, Comic Sans if you must. But again, it'll try to do this first one, and then it'll do the next one, and then the sans serif one. So a good way of setting these up is different types of operating systems like Windows and Mac and Linux. They will have a default font installed on them. I can't even think of any off the top of my head, but for example, you might want to put ones that you know will render on all those different types of operating systems. So for example, if they're on the Windows, it might display the one for Windows. If you're on a Mac and it doesn't have that Windows font, it might display whatever's next in line, which might be one for Mac. So just something to keep in mind when you set your font family. At a very minimum, you want to have serif or sans serif at the end, and then your desired fonts in front of it.